The moment is upon us. Kairos has arrived. Good morning, everybody. Those who are tuning in now and those who will be in the future. Here today in Traumatic Calculus, we will be taking a look at a few things that I have been working on in the regards of the Panotrivial, the tabletop role-playing game that will be the apogee of everything I've been working on for the last couple of years now. And alongside that, interlaced within, we'll take a look at finishing up Hotline Miami, and undoubtedly get that finished today. Now, this will be, I foresee, probably a shorter stream than usual, simply because, well, while I could go on and on and on about all of the little ramblings and details of things that I've worked through, which I do have some photographs of some of my physical writing that I'll be using as references for each little bit, to include a little bit of the equipment, some of the early ideations of how exactly the Panotrivial standard model should work, as well as some development of the various ideas for the actual dice mechanics themselves. We will probably, I'm thinking, maybe take around 2 to 3 hours. Not an extremely long thing, but it'll definitely give us the time to wrap up Hotline Miami in addition to that. So, with our mission stated here, we can talk about some of the updates. So, to begin with, I have decided that as this is not yet making me any money, and I do still have a life to live outside of the 45 to 50 hours that I average on my paying job, in addition to the endless amount of time that I spend on editing and developing and all of the additional stuff for YouTube, it is a strict requirement for me at this point to take at least 1 week out of every month off. And I think that will be the coming week starting, and I'll try and make this on a regular schedule. For those of you who might be able to tell, who have been attending to the various releases of the Threefold Manifold, we have had a weekly schedule where there is one stream at least on Monday or Tuesday, rather Tuesday or Wednesday, those being my days off since I work the graveyard shift. And then a steady release of at least 2 shorts a day per, or rather in addition to any of the other materials that I've been working on, like the segments of audiobook or the highlights that are the full compilation of all of those shorts. That takes a lot of time, in addition to the minute little things that I might want to update here, you know? This being my very first good effort at YouTube proper, let alone streaming. There are things that I'm adding and modifying all throughout, like you might be able to tell. The background here, I've done a little bit of modifying and reorienting, and I do plan on getting some... Ah, there we go. Okay. Okay, and now that we've resumed... Huh. Well, looks like our network is still giving us trouble. Another thing that some of you may have caught in some of the previous streams. Networks are what they are, and unfortunately, this is the world that we live in where it's not necessarily so smooth. But let's see what we can do here. I will reconnect to the stream, and I will be right back. And wouldn't you know it, of course, network errors. But to pick up where we had left off previously, all of this takes a lot of time. As you can see in this instance here, there are myriad little technical difficulties to troubleshoot and otherwise work around, as is, you know, the requisite for anybody who's working on streaming and content production. But ultimately, it is what it is. So I'll try for the first week of every month, but if there are any changes in that, I will reflect upon them in my social media, the Discord server, all of the places, and I'll even put a post up on YouTube, but there will not be a stream for that week, whatever it happens to be. This all being said, let us then, hopefully not encountering any further difficulties, move over to our game mechanics. And now, being a little less green to all of this, I will have a closer eye on exactly where my little camera is on my upper screen. So once more, if any of you see me darting my eyes to and fro, that'll be because I am checking the thing. But here we are. And let's make sure that we have our playlist going. And there we go. Okay. So what we're looking here at is one of my little notepad papers. For those of you who are familiar with Write and Rain, you'll know that it's a phenomenal product. It's fantastic. It resists water, oil, mud, all sorts of other things. And if you are doing just a single set of lines on a page, then it is excellent for holding on to them. That, however, makes it rather less than ideal if you should need to erase anything. So there will be a lot of things that I will have erased as I'm working on the specific morphology or the underlying choice of word based upon its semantics. That will require me to read some of these, as I understand my handwriting is not to the greatest appreciability of everybody, and furthermore, the paper doesn't really help. Once more, it is another blistering night here, or rather morning here in my little part of the world, so if I am taking some big sippies of my iced coffee, please do forgive such things. It's in order to keep me refreshed with coolant. So, coming to the initial stage here, we see some of the earliest iterations of the Panotrivial standard model back whenever it was called something else entirely, which I believe I had just went with the generic title of the Cosmologic standard model, back before I was thinking about metacosmology. How exactly we get to the individual instances of physics and such. But that manifests then as a series of 9 individual sides, if I recall rightly. No. It would be 11. Wow, I am really, really bad at recalling my old orientations. I should have just counted the dots. 8 on each side. And those 8 represented the various elements of what I was attempting to capture and what I have now in the panagrammars. That would be ultimately identity as well as causality. But those identity as well as causality. But those things and their constituent parts I had wrapped up in a lot of the aspects of physics that we are so familiar with, like the separability of various material, in addition to the flow of time within polylinear context. So ultimately, I did have a first draft of this core concept in something that comes approximate to the sort of threefold structure, but with all of the actual contents of what that meant departed. This image, this diagram, then, is a pictogram of what I was attempting to convey more thoroughly, breaking it down into more parts, so that those individual parts could be represented by what are now pulled together in the dialectophores. For those of you who have watched my Dawning of a Trivium stream, or any of the shorts that came out of it. For those of you who didn't, the sort of particulates, the substances that manifested under each and every one of these to allow some sort of mobility and representation, something that the players and the game masters could actually work with directly to get an effect done. That is to say, some carrier of value, some quanta. And that's why there were originally the 16 elements that would have come about, with 3 being a part of the main equivalents back then previously to the dialectices, those being the processes that actually made these physic phenomena happen. Apologies, a little bit of background noise. But those dialectices, the processes of making those happen, those physic processes, and therefore some method of explaining the regular physics alongside the additional ones outside of those regular set, the 9 that would have composed it, with some sort of higher or greater carrier, some kind of quanta. But then we have the explanations here, and I'll give a bit of a description for these. The idea was originally that there would be some sort of blend of the oppositions in a continuity as a process. That's what these black dots represent, in addition to the quanta that they would have carried. These would have all been contributory to one another in something of a cyclic flow that would have radiated or otherwise drawn. So very much, if for any of you who have read any of the Mistborn series, the sort of push-pull dichotomy that was established in allomancy, for instance. And I believe was also discussed and part of feruchemy too. But ultimately, the concept of an emanation on the left-hand side, that being the coloring in, the darkening being representative of fullness over fullness, such that it is expulsing. Then on the white side, the openness, the emptiness, the void, and that was meant to be the ultimate defining characteristic of not only the magic system, but the cosmology proper, being the immanent, to emphasize the specific spelling of the word that I am attempting to use, the flowing in that you might be able to note in something of the Panotrivium itself, as we have discussed it in its most recently displayed edition, but I have been further developing and finally am coming to something of a head of in terms of the proper first draft. More than we already had. I did have to rework a few elements here and there, but such as you have to do. So, within the old model you see here, those that have the blended aspect that are ultimately part of their side, as they are listed in the dichotomous, or rather drawn in the dichotomous split betwixt the two, but ultimately something that has more of, or rather some of, the opponent element in it, something that is not entirely constituted, but also not entirely vacuous. And that sort of, for those of you who are familiar with the terms of logic, the excluded middle, the partially true, partially false, or at least something that is between a is and an isn't, a becoming, if you would like to think of it in such a fashion. More along the lines of, oh, what is his name? Heraclitus of Ephesus. That sort of unity of opposites that plays into the even concurrent place, the concurrent model of the Panotrivium. This meant that ultimately, let's see, yes, my cursor is being recorded, good. You had, starting with the bottommost, collecting all of the, their side, the fullness, the emission, drawing it up to what is called, or was at the time, a drain. That is to say, one of the things that allows either a flowing out or a flowing in, and calls upon that, but pushes it over and completes the cycle. There's a split between the distribution to the utter vacuum, but also a collecting and a recycling of all of the vacuum energy, as it happened to be, that pulled in some of the emissive, well, I suppose we would have called them Panoviae now in today's parlance, but they certainly wouldn't have been called so previously. I believe I had mentioned them as, oh, I could pull up the document, but it's irrelevant. The collectors, the processes, as they happen to be. And those were also reflected in, naturally, their bearers, their fours, their, as we would have them now, dialectophores. And I'd also played around over here, as you can see, with there not being any kind of drains or exchanges, but each one of them pushing out and drawing in from one another in something of an equilibrious model, and all these lines would have ultimately culminated in what we now would call the dialectophores, their carriers. But, as you might have noticed, with the Panotrivium standard model as it's been presented, the complexity was too excessive, the grounding of it was not clean enough. I really hadn't started to study metaphysics and the philosophy that underlies it very strongly, and I hadn't even begun really to step into the realm of logic. So once I began to do those things and see, oh, I'm far from the first to ever really consider this in such an abstract fashion. There have been many philosophers and physics scientists that had observed, or natural philosophers that had observed and considered these matters well before, to such a degree. Yeah. Not exactly workable. However, the recognition of this, from what I had understood, barely grazing into the realm of philosophy in the trivium, the trivial sense. That is where I first developed the title Panadialectic, and that became the basis for everything that I would do moving forward. Huh. Interesting. I see here we have the Paint.net window not fully fitted. Now that is unusual. Ah, I see. I might have not cropped out the bottom entirely. Yep, that looks like it was the case. But that is okay. I would have sworn that I had gotten this taken care of earlier. My apologies, everybody. We will get it taken care of forthwithly. And there we have it. Let's get that more centered up. That is something I'll have to wrangle as I continue on with the presentation. This over here, this little corner, let's see, up there where my mouse cursor is, that was just a little bit of a note on my thoughts about one of the specific species that I was developing, and the kind of, before I had really gotten the axiologic model completely, like, put down, and to sort of culminate the ideas together, the division that they'll have in their axiologies, their ethics in a normative society. But whenever we get to presenting the species that I have envisioned, and that'll probably be paired up with me actually illustrating them, you will get to see the full extent of all of those details. We'll spare them for now. So now that we've explained some of the ancillary material, let's get on to some of the proper metrics. So, the Panotrivial game, the TTRPG, the mechanics, will largely be classless. Now, I understand some people are a little put off by the idea of a classless schema. Let's get that actually in frame. A classless schema. However, in order to fully capture the adaptability, the fundamental realities that are entailed in having a general system in a universally applicable character mechanic, we have to go a little bit more broad than I believe can be properly handled by something like a class system, as many are familiar with in things like, of course, Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, so on and so forth. Rather, we need something that is as useful for measuring everything from, say, a rock, which I know sounds a little bit silly, to a... I had used a Gestalt consciousness previously, but I think I'll go with now something like a mycorrhizal network of artificial intelligence. Yeah, quite a stark difference, I'd say. We need a little bit more of a broad... umbrella, I'll put it. In order to have that, while there are some derived statistics that would be really interesting to see manifest, what I think we will be going with instead, and of course for those of you who have an interest in the topic, feel free to let me know your thoughts on it, and I'll take them definitely into consideration. But we will need something that ultimately does as little derivation as possible. I apologize in order to block out the background noise. I do keep hitting one of the hotkeys and it moves the actual image. I think I'll go with the software button from here on out. But anywho, we need something that is broadly applicable then, and requires as few derivations as possible. In order to do that, we have in this mess, which is later refined, the beginnings, which is why I'll be skipping this, of the ninefold metric. And in order to get that metric, we'll take a brief look at these and give a little bit of developmental commentary upon them to give you all an idea of where I'm pointing all of this towards. So we have at the very beginning, let's see. It's been a while since I've looked at this page, since I've moved so thoroughly past it, but we begin with connection. Now, why connection? Well, connection is how a thing is put together. It's syntax, if you want to think of it in the linguistic context, as I am wont to do, but it is the necessary elements that hold a thing together. Again, coming back to it, anything from a tree branch to a planet-spanning bioform or organism. This then comes into the three parts that I decided would ultimately be the assemblies of it. The aspects of it. We have, starting with process, and this is bottom up if I recall rightly. No, at this point I was still going top down for how I wanted to arrange it. I didn't have a sort of nested stacking or contingent system at this point. These were all simply separate individual metrics. So we could really start in any order. But we'll go with power to begin with, because that is ultimately the kind of model that I believe I was going with at this point. So we have the power. And that's really quite commensurate with, let's say, strength, a more familiar statistic, something that we would have as the capacity to manipulate the environment with raw effect. not necessarily any amount of, well, as you'll see it in the following, precision, but ultimately the potency, the unmitigated, unadulterated potential. And I think the word is rather self-explanatory, as all of these are intended to be these terms that were actually put to use here. Then comes precision. Well, precision is the facility to use what one has at their disposal with care, dexterity, you might think of it. The minuteness, legerdemain that could be applied with any given operation. Then finally we have the process. That was intended to be akin to Constitution, although not necessarily. Constitution in and of itself has a more broad connotation as a means of health, as a means of hardiness. Well, while that is not so necessarily apart from process, that's not exactly what we are looking towards. That would be more appropriately applied to connection, but we'll get to that in a moment. For process, this was intended to be how well a being, a character, a thing, should it have the capacity at all, to metabolize, excrete, handle toxins in a similar fashion to how Constitution is regularly applied. But Constitution folds in, I think, a great deal of process and connection as a whole, in addition to some other elements here, but we'll get to those. But it is intended to be how well the body handles all of the things, the executive activities required to actually maintain it properly. And this was all meant to be brought together into, as it is underlined, connection. The connection is more the aggregate value, not therefore a derived value, as it is pulling them all together, of all of the aforementioned power, precision, and process, in order to give us a value that represents an interpretation of all of the genuine stuff, material, that is put into a subject. Now, you'll see that also pulled together into physique. Physique then ultimately is what we developed all of this into, and you'll see that pulled further in the following pages and all. But it was intended to be something of a metric for the base power, and then connection was to be something that was measured in terms of what we will now go on to show, or rather, what we go on to develop further as scope. Your connection then was going to be how vast, how complex a thing would necessarily need to be. And you had, at the very furthest end, the hypophores, mesophores, hyperphores, and symphores. Those, for those who might be those for the eagle-eyed and tiger-eared might notice that those were the exact suffixes that were pulled over into the dialectophores. Another piece of evidence for the iterative nature of the project, especially in terms of the cosmology, which required pooling a lot of different ideas. But this was meant to be a fourfold method of measuring your scope. Well, that's ballooned out to this point, but that will almost certainly be reduced back down into for later. For then the connection that was meant to represent that of a physique, the extent, the fullness of one such, in its individually measured values, which do not change despite the complexity that it might entail. You had one that was entirely dependent on the prevailing modus operandi. So this didn't take into account any amount of size, you can see, but merely the complexity, the intricacy. You had something that was entirely dependent upon the highest form of cosmology that existed at the time, and then one that was semi-independent, but still had some reliance upon some things that were above. Those that were fully independent and had no requirement of any higher cosmos, and finally one that was a fully encapsulating cosmos, this being the state of, well, what would become later the cosmos styles. That is to say, something that is in contrast with the Hyperfour. Something that is able to embody and fully encapsulate, engross, circumscribe all of those beneath it without any amount of difficulty, without any amount of counter, without any amount of discrepancy. Something that would take it all as a whole. And within that, I had played around with the idea of this maybe being the cosmos itself, but as we understand in the last presentation, Dawning of a Trivium, that simply became the cosmos styles. So now moving forward from the base, we have cognition, or rather, I should be more clear, interface. Interface being the bring together of all of the parts in a physique to a thinking subjective apparatus. So for those of you who are considering it, those that might be thinking of it, that is a movement from the object to the subject, from the completely objective to the subjective. So, to begin with, then, we have the instinct. The instinct, then, is what a physique is preloaded with. The thing that it is, well, frankly, sort of stuck with. As per the colloquial suggestion of the name, it's what a thing is meant to do autonomously, automatically. It has little to no choice. It's like getting a little tap with the doctor's or physician's hammer on the knee and having your leg kick out. It's like a sneeze. That then is followed up by intuition. That is the ability to think about thinking, further elucidated in the following imagery. Thinking about thinking. Taking not just your base, primitive necessities, conditionalities, in instinct, but being able to raise that a level above and consider the instincts, the information, the data that is being pulled into your physique in whatever methodology that it might be utilizing within its connection, and manipulating that data in a direct sense. It's not quite abstraction, but it's also not so base. It's arithmetic, almost algorithmic, you could conceive of it. And then finally, we have intellect. This is the full abstraction. This is the entire ability to think about thinking about thinking. The second order, if you will. Or if you want to think of it more in the predicative logical sense, the first order. Although in order to have the zeroth order in the first place, I would posit that you rather need to have the quiddity of something, the substance of a thing underlying already. So that is worked out for us. It goes a level of meta too far back, I would think. But your ideations on that might vary. But it's thinking about thinking, a second order process. Being able to not just manipulate the data, but manipulate the manipulation of the data. Something of a deliberation beyond merely algorithmically conceiving of the... Rather than being able to simply distill data, I think is a better way to put it. Being able to utilize the distilled data in a fashion that is derivative. Concoctive rather than decoctive. That is to say, rather than drawing out the mere essence of a matter, of some data, of some senses, being able to work with the distillations to make something new that is then fed back into the system. And that ultimately all comes together within cognition, which, as you will see right about here, I had to try and squeeze in since there was no room below with the little arrow. So, to start with the smallest, we have the hyposcheme. And I think that scheme is an appropriate word to be prefixed here, in that it is the template, the pattern that is put together within the confines of your interface. But to keep with the structure, the selection of the Greek prefixes, we have hypo, of course, under, meso meaning in the middle, and hyper meaning over. For those of you who are, not into all the etymology as I have necessarily been. To be finished with the syn scheme. Now, SYN, for those of you... Now, SYN is something that you may have noticed within the words of synthesis, syntax, syntagm, for the linguistically inclined. That is to represent semantically a combination, a bringing together, a not necessarily summing, but consummatory process, condition, or state of affairs. Much like we have, as you heard there, com. That comes from the lemma of con, Latin, to say very much the same things It could be used as an intensifier as to suggest that it is complete or whole or total, absolute maybe, depending on the exact context of the usage. But it is that. And it modifies in a similar fashion, where, as I said, the lemma, the canonical base root of the word, is con, at least if my memory serves. Sin is also the lemma, again, I actually do remember this, sun. Sun is the lemma of the Greek equivalent. A cognate is the term that I believe is most appropriate there. So it does modify as you go, hence the sim4 in the SYM in front of the 4, modifying to that specific consonant. Then sin within scheme to be modified before an S. Now, I don't know the specific grammatical reasons for that, and I would suspect that it has, in the case of ancient Greek, to do with Proto-Hellenic, excuse me. And in the case of Latin, to do with Proto-Indo-European, maybe even in both of them. But I'm not a professional linguist, to put it mildly. Beyond that, the scheme of the interface flows together into cognition. Cognition is simply the process of making some mental, specifically psychological, calculations. And that is, of course, intended to contrast with the physique, the objective to subjective, not creating a mind-body duality, but recognizing the emergent characteristics of cognition, thinking. Then we have the calculation element of things, the simulation. Now that draws very directly upon Jean Baudrillard, the philosopher who some would say is a post-structuralist, some even would extend to say a postmodernist, but would ultimately say that there is an element, at least, of recognizing the disintegration of narrative in the sociological sense and universal episteme within at least the West especially, but definitely extending over the extent of the world. Then, for those of you who... Then, for the readers of at least a system of objects, and very probably more immediately, Simulacra and Simulation. Fantastic book. Excellent little inspiration for The Matrix, in case you might be familiar with the scene of Neo opening the book where he hides things within. Clever bit of symbolism. Very semiotic, all of it. Very semiotic, all of it. You will understand immediately. Those that don't, naturally, as this is a rather obscure and very highly abstract idea. Simulation is the production of simulacra, which I know creates something of a circular explanation, but I'll go further into it. Simulation, then, is the development of references. That's a semantic term. I suppose you could also apply it syntactically, depending on your thoughts on syntax. But the creation of references, that is something that calls, indicates, points to something else. that have no object. Not in reality, anyway. Nothing in the real that it represents. Well, that then makes the simulacrum, the singular form of simulacra, directly from Latin, but Jean Baudrillard is a Frenchman, as I understand it. Simulacrum then is one such. It is a symbol. It is entirely arbitrary, but it purports to reference something that is real. This leads to spans of hyper-reality. That is, for those of you, keep repeating myself on that, that is, if you caught it before, above reality, hyper-real. It is a medium, a semiotic medium, that then makes use, it chains together, it connects, it interfaces all of those simulacra, those references without reference in reality, together. So it's references without reference, referencing one another. That is a chain of hyperreality. And that is the basis for the concept of simulation. And this got further refined and made far less abstract, I think, in what you'll be seeing in the following images. But this is still the underlying idea. The underlying idea just got pushed into the cosmology. That's why we have the Panotrivium standard model now. That is why there is the panogrammars, the panodialectics, and finally the panorhetorics. That all came into a single base for reality. Now, an element of this is now part of that idea set is carried over into the more current, more concurrent developments, but it is not the whole and sum of it as we have represented in this older piece. Rather, simulation as it was conceived of here was all of the linguistic elements that then became merely a part of the Panotrivian standard model. Starting off with the semantics, that was the meaning that underlies everything. The true concept that is held by a character, a being. And that was put into the sort of magical system. This is as of present called Historio. That is coming from the root that we're familiar with, history. Well, where that came from was ancient Greek Easter, or Historia, specifically, an account of something, a recording of something, a telling of something, right? Well, then the individual which does Historio, Easter, is that individual, that who is creating a simulation, that who is producing the basis for reality, creating hyperrealities. Now, of course, all of that is outdated, but it is the current standing term, as I have not moved on to redoing Historio from the previous iterations, what have you. Then the simulation itself properly comes into the semantics, the meaning of what you're putting into it, the concepts. Yeah, they might not have any actual basis in existence, they might be hyperreal, but they are still present. Hence why they're not called hyper-irreal. They are reality, they are a part of reality, even if they are not a part of fundamental reality. As you might be able to go back to, taking a look at the previous stats, You had instinct first, power first in their separate categories, and they built up to a degree of abstraction, not full, but partial. Such as with semantics. In order to have language, you have to have a concept. Therefore, in order to have concept, you have to have intellect, at least to a limited degree. So then here we are. Semantics. That was going to be able to be measured in simple word count. And that is not sufficient. But it is at least an interesting notion. Then we come to the syntax, the structure of how you put those concepts together. Concepts need not necessarily be structured in and of themselves. They can be implicit, emic, but not necessarily etic. They might not be able to have any surface, even if they have all the content in the world. So then we have such. The syntax, the order as it is brought together. Then finally we have the semiotics. The semiotics are themselves the organization of the meanings together in signs, significations. That's a very abstract thing to try and broach. If you are interested in it, there is, if I recall rightly, it's Kripke. I should perhaps check on that. No. Kripke was all about the designators. I know it's a bit of a break in the flow, but I do want to make sure that I am at least crediting the right individual. Well, it's been talked about by a great number of people over time. It's been talked about by a great number of people over time, but that what I am drawing from here, beyond the basis of Aristotelian logical meaning, the signs as they are applied in a logical fashion, is saucer, the signifier and signified, as the baseline. But then moving on to Charles Saunders. Pierce or Peirce? I go with Pierce, but I've heard it pronounced otherwise. But Charles Saunders, I'll avoid the last name. This was going to be represented as making the interpretant of the semantics, and then the representamen of the syntax, to bring that back down into a more common colloquial parlance, that is to say, turning the meaning into what people get, or what is understood in the face of hyperreality, which then trickles down to create real reality, the base reality, the zeroth order reality, or at least the first order reality, as all of the cosmology up here was going to sort of illuminate. But all of that in the hyperreal. And then the syntax would be what is actually put through, what is fulfilled, what is, how should I say, a representamen. It is a direct signification, an immediate representation, a radiant, an emission, you can think of it, of an actual object, something that is coming from the object, that is to say, the thing that exists in reality, goes away from that. You can think like sun rays, or nuclear radiation, if you want to think of it in that way, heat, even all of the radiant elements, that is then taken in by a subject in the interface, and actually made so as a meaning. The order coming from things that is received by a subject and turned into meaning. Then finally we have the semiotics themselves, which are the hyperreality as a object. An object with no beginning. An object with no start. A circular object. Coherentistic, infinitistic, and foundationalistic simultaneously. Simulation. And that was all to be encapsulated under the scopes of calculation. Those calculations would be represented in the forms of a hypoplex, mesoplex, hyperplex, and simplex, or synplex. Now, these are chosen in plex, as to say, if I recall rightly, it is a arrangement. But let me double check on that, because it's been a while. It is a suffix unto itself. Fold. Well, how about that? Yes, so it is fold. The fold of a thing, as you might be reflecting upon in the threefold manifold. The simplex made complex, if you would like. And that is where I got the idea of threefold manifold from. Something that's less Greek and more English. That we can actually parse in our own languages as English speakers or those who are trained in such a thing, even if not native to it. So these, where the schemes were relevant to the interface. That would be to say the scopes of how big thine brain be, how much cognition one can actually handle by scale, to the physique, the connections, which needed to be recorded and accounted for in terms of not just the mass of a thing, but also what kind of dependency are we looking at here? What kind of contingency needs to be taken note of? But finally, we have the calculation, which has the many folds of complexity, of hyperreality, where the semantics are themselves, as I had mentioned, a mere concept. It is ephemeral in and of itself. With the organization of the syntax, it has the order. It steps up. It goes in order above mere concept to arranging them in such a fashion. And finally, in semiotics, it combines the two. It makes something of orders unto themselves, structures, edifices, liths, monoliths or polyliths. You bring it together into simulation, into calculation. The hypoplex then would have recalled some of the lesser fours, some of the lesser carriers. The mesoplex, would have called for those middling, and those in the hyperplex would have called upon the utmost, landing in the semiotics primarily, and that's where the basis of power would have been found. And finally, well, all of these could have been brought together into a synplex, such as it is. And these are the basic ideas that went into making the foundational elements for the Panotrivium, the threefold manifold in its entirety, and bring together a character sheet, as we are now, or rather, as I am now working on it presently, whenever I'm not working on YouTube business. but we have been talking for about an hour on this topic, getting a lot more content out of it than I necessarily thought we would. I might save some of this for a coming presentation, but we'll at least get through all of the foundational elements here. In the meantime, we're going to cut over to some Hotline Miami, because it has been a while, a whole week. This would be our third part, and I'd like to get the thing done with, because I have reserved some of my commentary on it till the present. Let's actually get over to the unmuted Miami. And look at that. The audio is not playing for me, but the music is at 39%. Aha. I see, I see. Well, that would be because I had my speakers set as the output device. Let's get that fixed right quick. Technical difficulties. We must love them. Got to love them. But at least we've gotten a lot of conversation about all the basics. It might simply be that the game launching with my external speakers is not able to properly transition over since it's a rather old game. Okay, well, I would not hope to keep you all's attention if I'm going to be futzing about with this. So I'll give it a couple more seconds. And barring success there, I will have a recess and see you all back here in just a few moments. And it looks like it's so. In that case, the moment will return. And lickety split so easy. Got it fixed. Nailed it. Okay. Let me make sure that we are actually recording the audio. And it looks so. Of course, if you all don't hear anything, please let me know. Let us then continue with Chapter 14. Vengeance. Back to Rasmus as we are wont to. South 86th Street. Now let's hope that we don't have the rust from before still bothering us. So much for that. Okay. I get a little adjusted here. And here. Boom. I'm surprised they were actually delayed for a change. through the doors. Ah, so close. You know, it might be the nice cold drinks. Or simply having to exercise... Oh, talking about something in such depth. But I'm feeling a little bit more confident than last couple tries. Nah, man. Nobody's here. Guaranteed. Don't worry about it. I'm not around the corner. It was just the wind. That too. Ah, yeah. Now that's a proper weapon I can work with. I'm so nervous around these. Such big open areas. Why nobody was there behind the glass? Easy as. Yeah, hello, I'd like to order something. Never mind then. And I think I'll keep with the AR for now. Oh, really? I'm surprised. None of them popped through. Total whiff. Absolute miss. Now let's go melee a little bit here then. Oh, that's not good. It's interesting it didn't get caught before. Yeah, I guess he was just out of earshot. Let's get the shotgun, please. Boop. Try that on for size. You know, I think number 12 is just fit for you. No, that's a tricky bit. I'm definitely not gonna blow all of our ammo before we get to them. Ooh. Maybe jump a touch. I was for sure that he would just be out of eyesight. Ah, and there's that puzzle piece. So long sought after. And our bad lad is taken care of. Decided to feed the wall? As you do. My ass was grass, for that was glass. Why would you slow down after hearing shots, my man? Morning. Oh, no. Don't mind it. Yeah, not so swell. Rise and shine. I gotta get to the other side, where they decide to do something about me. Oh, 180 no scoped. Hard fail. I gotta remember to pick up that puzzle piece. No point in leaving money on the table. Yo, I got 2 for 1. I got the bird and the bush. Ooh, that's not good. Sniped from a distance this time. Gonna have to play it a little bit. A little bit careful here. Hope, man. I was hoping I could get around that wall, but no dice. Not the right time to miss. All right. Just out of timing. Did we get him? Not that time. Glad that didn't get their attention. Boop. I was hoping they would have a shotgun that go. C'est la vie. Hup, hup. Ah, got it. Now that's what I like to see. Now we at least have some means of getting rid of, Big Baddie over here. Hey, bucko! Oh, bad trade. That is not ideal. You know, I guess that one didn't follow the common advice. Don't let the door hit you on your way out. Not a gun one. That puts us in a bit of a pickle. Walked right through him. I could serve just enough ammo. You know what? We'll give that a shot. That's not happening that round. Alright. Oop. I'll move back and forth like a sliding door until you come this way. How about you? This is chivalry, bruv. Okay, good. And done. Okay. Just enough ammo to even pick off from the other side. Yeah, man! I'd like to get over there without getting shot. Oop. Come on. Accuracy! You know, it's a little bit less than, 1 MOA, I think. Wow, poor lad. Well, see if we'll be able to make our fortunate run over here. Promising. No way I'd be able to hit him from the other side, is there? Oop. Look, man, I don't want no trouble here. The safe is open, just take what you want and go. Look, I'm not the owner. He's not here. I just run the club. Let's be civil about this. Alright, alright. I'll give you his address. Just, please don't hurt me, okay? He's on Northeast 114th Place. Please, just go now, okay? Yeah, sure. Bye. I should probably grab something with some rounds in it, just in case. Oh. I guess he is another one I have to take out. Bazinga. Let's try that again. Bazinga. Never mind. I guess you're bulletproof, huh? This only? Looks like it. Bazinga. There we go. Alright, not too bad. I'm gonna guess something like a C+. B-. Better than expected. Ooh, and a new mask and a weapon? The sledgehammer. Final chapter. Showdown. Let's see what we got for that new mask. Darkness. Sure, I'll give it a shot. Ah, Virtua Boy vision. Interesting, but not what I'm going for. Now, for those of you who don't know, kind of dwarf-pilled NGL fam. So anytime there's a hammer of any description, I'm gonna be about it. Hey, what up? You around here? Going good for you? Hard work day? I know what you mean. And right off, didn't even have to look for it. I feel like there's something over here I'm missing. I'm sure it'll be relevant later.
And who do we have here? You must be one of the assholes killing off my men. Doesn't look like you were here to chat. So why don't we get this over with?
Oh, okay. Yeah, no good there. But I see pickups all around. What's that do? bloody trophy. I'm the prize fighter. Ooh. That was not fair. That was way out of hitbox. Oh, man. Yeah, I figured that wasn't gonna be a winning blow. Can I get them? Nah. Okay. I hadn't commented on it, but it's awfully bold for him to walk in without... Oh. So she's involved too. Alright. Figured it might be worth a throw. Gotcha. Leave him to me. Ooh. Yeah, gonna have to focus for this one. Not so casual as the rest of it. Just out of time. Let's see. Okay, I can't get in that pool. But seriously, to walk in here without a gun, that's wild. Yo, is that a djinn? Might be running around with a djinn? Swag. Yeah, that's, I wonder if a throw would work there. Did I miss, or did it not interact? That's the real question. Hitboxes. Just enough time to lock on. Now, if only we walked in here with a bandolier full of grenades. Look at it. Just gotta believe. Ah, yes. Now was the winning blow. Ah, man, I missed that.
Not bad. I'm impressed. I wonder what gave you this thirst for blood. I've never seen anything quite like it. Now I want to see who's hiding behind that mask.
Yo! Alright, send me right back to the beginning then. Ah. Gotcha. Okay, so clearly I've got a position behind the fountains. Are they using the same sound effects for the tigers as the dogs? Aha! Good luck, buddy boy. Ah, but I can't get him with his own trophy. Let's see how you like knives then. guess I'll have to be closer. Really? I can't hit him with a throw? Alright, well that does it. I can't tell if his hands are bloody, or if I cut one of them off. Lucky run. That is way uncool. Not what I wanted to pick up. And once more. Come on, old allies is here to get you. A little too forthcoming on that one. Reload. Lock on. Bingo bongo. Could have got that knife, but I didn't want to risk the time.
Yep. I can see where this is going. I'll spare you the pleasure.
Now that's delivery. And this is DiGiorno. Hello? Hello? What's going on down there? I'm trying to sleep. Is there anyone there? Can you hear me? Hello? Goddamn phones. I fucking hate these things. Click. Alright. I guess I got a pistol now, huh? That's one hell of a trophy. I wonder if that's fully automated. Does it hit the corners? I don't know, we'll have to see. But not for this playthrough. Ah, do we have more area? Hello, bucko. Ah, so you're the one causing the ruckus. What's your business here? Actually, why don't we skip the details? I've done so many horrible things. Nothing seems to really matter anymore, does it? I'm not going anywhere, as you can see. Just go ahead and do whatever you came here to do. So we did. And after all of that murder, after all of that slaying, even the one we just did, little left to do but pitch out a photograph and light up a cigarette. And if that's not truly iconic of the game itself, I don't know what is. A real symbol of the ephemerality of it all. The heedlessness of violence. Put so carefully and thoughtfully on display. Where I was holding my review in full back before, I think it's fair to say my take on it is merely that violence is violence. It's syntactic. It has no meaning inherent to it. It's arbitrary. It only exists in the the semiotic apparatus, the scaffolding, if you would like to think of it as such, the matrix of us, of we beings. After all, if a natural occasion, a car crash, a lightning storm, a tornado, a tsunami sweeps something by and obliterates it, sends it straight to oblivion as if it never existed in the first place, or even more entertainingly and perhaps interestingly, simply sweeps it out of all human comprehension in any way we would be able to tangibly reunion with it. You don't ascribe violence to it, not in any literal sense, not in any factual way. Nothing ametaphoric or anti-analogous. The thesis of violence simply is violence. And to engage in it then is but an action, an activity, a changing from a potential to an actual in the psychological realm, the psychological extent. To engage in something most semiotic, most communicative. As once more, it demands intent. It demands the subject to at least engage itself unto some end of destruction, deliberate or otherwise. And even in that, the partitioning of an accident, say a child swinging its arm and hurting someone unintentionally, the piloting of a drunk driver into someone and injuring them, the myriad unintentional things that occur in the proximity and consequence of warfare. They might be violence in the literal sense, in the immediate and purely ontologic sense. They are categorically thus violent. But they fall into an entirely separate recognition. They have a completely different sense behind the reference, behind the object itself. But no matter the case, it is investiture. And to engage in investiture necessitates that there is a loss of opportunity, an opportunity cost in doing so. One of the questions that has stuck with me from the beginning of the game was, do you like hurting people? Something I've come back to once in a previous stream and playthrough. I believe the significance of that question is not so simple as, what are the social ramifications? What are the psychological impacts on the individual themselves? On the individual themselves. But the semiotics of it, the signification. Now, every sign, as we discussed earlier, but I'll elaborate here, has an object, in this case, the violence itself is an object. But no sign stands unto itself. Hence, reality is a chain, a network of signifiers and signifieds. That which is sending out, emitting the meaning, the signifier, and the signifieds. That is to say, what is being the emitter, what is being perceived, what is being taken as such. And that necessitates, therefore, an etiology. Once more, if you are familiar with the etiology of the Panotrivial, you understand the meaning of the word, but I'll explain further. That is the account or study of causes. Medically, we might call these symptoms. You know, symptomology, an account of symptoms. But when we examine that less in the literal, tangible sense, the corporeal sense, and consider it more from the psychological, there is an etiology, a trace of causations that determine the significance of that answer. Do you like hurting people? It speaks to more, in other words, now that you witness, or at least have explicated for you, the implicature of it all. Why one might desire violence, why one might enact such an activity furthermore, that they may or may not like hurting people, why they might abstain, why they might withhold, why they might avoid ideation upon such a subject, even. It speaks to the core of the individual, their semiotic foundation, their radix, their root. How exactly they take such an answer, make such an answer. Now we know Jacket's answer. For whatever cause, whatever ideology that lies underneath it, whatever radix they approach it from, they do it. And they do it exceptionally well. They do it as we engage with the game itself, the medium. Hotline Miami. By our will. If we didn't play the game, there would be no violence committed, nothing enacted, nothing done, nothing made violent. Regardless of what exactly has happened to Jacket in the course of the game, the beginning, the manipulation by phone calls as we uncover it, the events themselves, going to the various locations and committing said violence. Even the near ending of Jacket's life and ending up in the hospital to then get up and do more violence. No matter what happens to this figure, we compel them. Communicatively. Perhaps not so unlike the phone calls themselves, manipulating the individual, coming through the wires, digitally arriving to them and making demands of them they cannot refuse. Perhaps Hotline Miami is the violent mirror. And as for all of us, whether you have played the game or you're simply watching the game, whether you hold that potential in you, that you enjoyed seeing the gameplay itself for the violence, maybe you didn't enjoy it at all, but simply the story, the communication itself, the exchange of signs. Or maybe you revile such content in its entirety. That's up to all of us to decide. As for me, I enjoyed what I played. I would argue that violence is simply necessary in some circumstances. It's something that we all toy with, even those who attempt to keep it to themselves. Who might, in fact, fall into the category of those who revile such content. Even the mere discussion of such things. But revulsion is in and of itself an expression, I feel, in my non-professional opinion, of the unknown, a lack of control, a lack of command, a lack of permissibility within one's own psyche, one's own consciousness. Rather than that, I elect to recognize the fact of the matter in that there are opportunities that will be cost, doing or not doing, recognizing or not recognizing. And as one who elects to recognize all that he very well may, all that I am capable of, this is no exception. This aspect of opportunity. And that simply sometimes a cost must not be allowed to happen in the lieu, in the stead of other opportunities. It simply is a cost that must be exacted. But perhaps you disagree. Or perhaps you do agree. For the same or other reasons. No matter, Hotline Miami, I give a 10 out of 10. I give it for each of the hands that our pre-boss at the very end to taking out the old man did no longer have after we pitched knives at him. 10 whole fingers. Brilliant game. I think that especially those who have any amount of interest in semantics, greater meaning than merely the surface level, this might be a game for you. And even if you just happen to appreciate tactical, fast-paced top-downs, it's a good one. And it's got replay value in spades. If for no other reason, besides the raw gameplay itself, the raw mechanics themselves, the pure aesthetic of it, the tile sets are phenomenal. The art overall is brilliant. The writing is perfectly subtle. And the vibe kinda rocks. And that's the long and short of my thoughts on Hotline Miami. So let's then come back to our notes. Now that we've taken a look at numero uno, I do have 5 pages here, but I think after the second page, being that we have gotten almost to 2 hours, we will wrap that up. And this is rather where we start to get into the continued build-up of our ideas, the clarification of everything that we had been working on previously. I believe this was the latest addition to the works before I finalize them. Let's check over quickly. Yes, these are in fact the first portions. So we'll get through, let me zoom out so you can see my mouse proper. All of this stuff and all of this stuff, and we'll save the rest for another day. So, to recap on what we were talking about before, we have the course ideas, the course aggregate material of our basis for not only what became the Panotrivium standard model, a lot of the specific morphology and semantics that went into it, as well as the threefold manifold overall, but also a little bit of the, a substantial portion of all of the ability scores, you might think of them as. Lining those out further, and this came far later. This came during that period where my phone was busted, all of a sudden. Thanks, Google. And, well, I made do. I'm not one to simply leave it be, take it easy. So, coming to the very top, we have, and some of the verbiage here has changed. In particular, let's get this section here. Yeah, that's changed a good deal. In terms of the specific words that are used, they have a good basis, but they're not precise enough to the idea that I want to convey. So starting from the top, we now have a properly arranged top-down, that is to say, ascending model for our ability scores. We have the instinct, we have the intuition, we have the intellect. That's part now of intercatenation. What does that mean? Intercatenation is the blending together, the convoluting of various distinct, discrete elements or parts. Specifically, if I recall rightly, catenation is a term used in textile work. Yes. Correct. And given that it means, coming from catenatus, meaning chained, then catena, something of a learned borrowing, evidently, in catenate. Chain. Used in crochet. So then, interchaining. Chaining between. Inter meaning between, or in the midst of, or in contact betwixt catenation. And of course, ation meaning a process or a state of, in this case, it is a nounification. It is declaring this as a particular thing, hence the capitalization. Additionally, a specific person, place, or thing. So, a chaining between. Well, a chaining between the instinct, intuition, and intellect. That is the combination, the surmise of such things. Then we have a bit of a change. I realized that in what was previously the interface section, this right here, this area, well, in order to have anything resembling a connection in the first place, you have to be able to maintain, right? Yeah, most certainly. Before, I think I was considering more from an immaterial sort of magical, historic perspective, more than I was the tangibilization that I was striving for ultimately, hence the refinement as we're going down the line. As we're going down the line. So, you begin with process. Fair, I think. And then the power. Taking it not necessarily so literally as strength alone, but also the capacity to actually make the processes more firm, more yielding, more productive, more capable, so on and so forth. And then finally, in order to actually have precision, in order to exercise something analogous to or alike, congruous to dexterity, you have to be able to manage that power, that those processes, modulate them, enact them, make something of them. And so it now sits at the highest element. The reason I'm explaining these rather than the calculatory, intercatenatory ability scores is, I think, rather obvious. We all have something of a intuitive grasp, to define a little or use words a little circularly with intuition here. We all have an intuitive grasp of what all of these things mean psychologically or mentally. But these a little bit more refined in the corporeal manifested form. And now, these are not stacked in such a way that they represent an order for things to go into, necessarily. I am considering it. What is going into this organization right here, and I may solidify it further, although I'll have to consider it for a while. And here's, of course, another area where you all's input is highly valued. But in order for there to be a proper connection, something that is not necessarily animate, but at least possesses some trait or property, some quality of being a subject able to be defined here, you need to have, at minimum, an instinct. At minimum, some kind of hard, unabstracted code that is followed to enable the communication of your parts, your elements, the things that make you, you. Whether they are cells, whether they are wires in a machine, whether they are the strands of RNA or DNA that are employed in viruses. In order to be distinguishable from an environmental thing, you must have some instinct, some code, some means of sending signs and receiving signs and making sense of the signs, such as it is. And in order to then have the composition, which replaces, as we had over here, our calculation, and the calculation then goes up to the intercatenatory area, we have composition, a a bringing together, position, a putting together of things, yes. That is to say, an assignment of all of these individual characteristics to something that is more than each of the individual parts. Whether you're considering that more from a set perspective or a mereologic part-whole relation perspective, it's the way that an individual relates, ultimately, how that manifests is in how its historio, its magic, is contingent, how it works, how it applies. And this is a pretty direct repurposing, redux of our calculation section itself, as you'll see explained. You have the microtaxes, which is simply the combination of semantics and syntactics in a connotative sense. That is to say, as it is being applied to an ultimate meaning, an ultimate conception proper, the lowest level, like we see with the others here. It's in an ascendant order. In an ascendant order. That then is followed by the mesotaxis. I should probably explain the actual etymology of these. Micro, small, or miniaturized. Meso meaning in the middle, or at the middlemost level, and macro meaning a big, large, on a scale that is recognizably a whole rather than some parts. Within the scale that we're looking at things on. So the mesotaxis then is more of the syntactic element. Where the microtaxis works on the meaning, the mesotax primarily works to the aims of putting meaning and order together into a concept. Mesotaxis is more about taking those concepts and putting them into some sort of arrangement, some sort of conglomeration, some sort of construction, rather than an essence. The macrotaxis, excuse me, is more about the semiotic element than it is about taking your constructed essences, your conglomerated concepts, and turning them into abstractions themselves, concocting these things, turning them into a system unto themselves, some sort of system made of systems. Yeah. And that all comes together in meta. Not that you can much read it, thanks to the, let's zoom out a little bit, see if you can get that. Yeah, there you go. The meta-taxes. Again, I do apologize, the paper is not very good at letting go of graphite once you got it. A benefit and a drawback. But meta-taxes, meta as in after. A lot of people who simply hear the term metaphysics or hear meta as in like gameplay meta might think of it as before. Not so. In fact, it also comes from Greek, meaning that it comes after, is in the midst of, or is beyond. Not necessarily dissimilar, though not entirely cognate with Latin ultra as a prefix, which once we present further on the more completed draft of the Panotaxic standard model, we'll get more into seeing terms prefixed with ultra, but that will come in the future. But a meta-taxis, taxis, of course, meaning order, as we established previously in syntax, is simply with the suffix of is. That is to say, rather than sis, S-I-S, a process. This is a state. Meta, taxis, in this case, beyond order, or an order beyond. Hence why meta is able to be used in English in such a fashion as to mean something that instructs things beneath, something that precedes, or ultimately is an order above the current or immediate happenings, circumstances, mechanics. sense, meta gaming, playing above the mere mechanics, playing above the mere interaction themselves, going a step beyond. Meta mechanics, meta plays, so on and so forth. I think you'll probably pick it up by this point. The ordering beyond, then, is how all of these things come together. If you have a very a mild microtaxis, you're not going to be able to get your mesotaxis properly. If you have a very mild mesotaxis, you're not going to be able to get your macrotaxis properly. And so your metataxis is very closely connected with your composition, of putting together, a placing amongst others of its like, or of a group. What does this all culminate as, then? Simulacrum. That is your simulacrum. And your simulacrum, as we established previously, is an object without reference. An object without reference exists in the hyperreality. The hyperreality exists above the substance. The substance is what we had described in the Panotrivial standard model as the dialectophores. They are compelled and enabled by the dialectices. Those are able to exist on the basis of the panagrammars, or grammagens if you want to be more general and generic. So, for a character with an ability score, a simple metric for their meta-taxes, their order beyond, there has to be something that they interact with simulacrally within the hyperreality, the simulation, that enables them to exist, right? Because the substances, as we established previously, the dialectophores, they don't have any kind of tangibility, they don't have any kind of corporeality, they are entirely ethereal, they stand above, they are the meta substances, if you want to think of it like that. To put this into more player-friendly terms, what magic lets you be? What magic constitutes you? What magic are you contingent upon? If you want to look at something, a setting like Greyhawk, what in the weave lets not only your realm, but you exist, keeps you sustained, preserves you as you continue forward? What even is the forward that is to be preserved? What is, in the metaphysic sense, the beyond physical sense, to draw upon the etymology of meta and physic? So, then, now that we have all of these established, you can also see, right alongside, they have a scale statistic, the calculation, connection, and composition. Those will be went into later. Far later, in fact. Here we have the scale, if you want to take a quick look at it and guess as to what exactly this is now working on the basis of. But that will be expressed and explained more immediately going forward in another presentation, another stream. So now that we have the importation of the Roughout done, we can get into the more working definitions for what all of these mean. So starting off, we have instinct, and you can see these are numbered. These relate to the orders that we were talking about, orders being the extents of abstraction away from the pure being, the reality, the substance of the thing, the elevation. And I think the easiest way to think about this is probably in the logical context, where you have a 0th level something that is propositional logic that is going to be simply declarative. It is decidable. It is true or false. You can, of course, use multi-valued logic, but even that is declaring certain states, conditions, presences of a value, of some kind of state of affairs, condition. The first order, predicative logic, that is to use predicates, well, can do a number of things, but in its bare form, it's all about existences and universals. What can we say of all things in a particular kind of existence? And what kinds of particular existence are able to be modeled out as universal? What can be said of all, in the universal section, and what can be said of at least one in the existential? So you can see, predicative logic subsumes, it abstracts, it takes further, it elevates your propositional logic. And then finally the second, before we move on, it's less decidable, right? Because it is a statement of affairs that is an abstraction, yeah, you're going to have issues with deciding the exact truthfulness or falsehood of a thing. You need then to more rely upon validation and non-contradiction, principles that are very important if you're trying to come to any kind of a conclusion. It's imperative. It states what is as a necessary, as a command, as a demand, if you wish to think of it as such. And I do. Where the second order logic, well, there's a lot of different kinds. A lot of these are modal. A lot of these are even further abstractions. It's abstracting the abstraction. It is taking not just is something or is it not here on the 0th order, but then it's taking the first order, which is naturally this is going to be how it is. It exists, or it is universal. It exists across many existences as a necessary. And then it goes, okay, well, now that we have those set, we can do all sorts of things with that. We can make it as statements of accessibility. Either something is conditioned on multiple predicates altogether in a new formulaic sense, or it is processed out through something like maybe a state of desires, a state of more analog, fully or most entirely undecidable material, like belief logic, which does actually exist. It's all about how thinkers think about thinking. And so you can see the 0th, 1st, and 2nd, the 3 orders of logic already demonstrated within the structure of that very sentence. Right. So, instinct, then, as the 0th order ability score, is the baseline programs of any engine, be they cellular, chemo responses, up to and beyond. I apologize, again, these photographs do not really do much justice to the actual images, or the visuals themselves. Up to and beyond automatons, muscle controls, or stimulus parsing, thoroughness of thoroughness of software to not bottleneck hardware. So you see, as I was saying previously, this is the necessary stuff for a subject to exist, even if they cannot think subjectively. The first order, where they do begin to think subjectively, then, is intuition. Thinking about parsed stimuli. Conscience proper. All core maths of notions and concepts derivable from materially demonstrable inferences. the capacity to infer, the capacity to reason, at least in its most essential and rudimentary form. That is intuition. And then finally, we have what demands both of these in sufficient quantity: intellect. Inferences in, of, and by formal abstractions. A full realization of consistent, logical systems. That might be unreadable. I do not have my notepad on me immediately, so I can't reference the source material besides. I'm going to adjudicate that says builds unto valuating concepts, states, and projections about themselves. And finally, we have the infinite order, because of course it is able to be represented infinitely, as there may be many more layers of abstraction on top of these. But those are not something that are easily recognizable and are definitely at least axiomatizable into the lower levels of logic. Now, of course, there is a sort of argumentation, a contention about second-order logic in and of itself, especially in that the decidability of first-order logic, thereby intuition, is, provable, is demonstrable, is necessary, ultimately, for expressing the full force of logic to whatever power that we wish to exact of it. But it is then intercatenation. And intercatenation is an absolute value. We can measure the absolute value of processing power. We know this. We have all kinds of metrics for computers. Well, what are living beings with a degree of programmatic or conscious development, existence, besides computers of a sort? Whether they are biological, whether they are entirely artificial, whether they are magical, they are absolutely computing. Now, the modes, the modalities, might be entirely incomparable, as I think is very self-evident between the biological computation and the digital computation, even though there may be some sharing of the means, that is to say, for instance, in particular, where there is, of course, the digital switch in, let's say, a processor. There may be some on-off binary element within a biological processor, but outside of the raw programmatic element, the instinct, if you like, well, there's way more to it than that, and they can't be compared. Not in that way, at least. Not methodologically. But intercatenation, then, is the ability to transcribe, transceive, and arbitrate information by one or more interoperated. Now that is quite difficult to read. Interoperated anatomic, sorry, it looks like it says epistems. Yes. The ability to transcribe, transceive, and arbitrate information by one or more interoperated epistems. What does that mean? That means the ability to operate on different levels of knowledge. Take that knowledge, do something with it, and finally, make an effect. Make a happening. Again, separated along the lines of, if you have it, instinct, intuition, or intellect. So then we come over to the physique. We have as the 0th order the capacity to interact as a net structure within its immediate environs to perform both self-sustaining operations and manage the necessary throughputs of its design. Capacity to interact as a net structure within its immediate environs to perform both self-sustaining operations and manage the necessary throughputs of its design. Power is the, I believe, yes. Power is the resultant facility from a design's fulfillment to enact the constituent aims of its purposes. Precision is acuteness, scalability, and scopeability of a fulfillable purpose. And physique, which is relative, meaning that there is, yes, many ways of measuring all of these. It does heavily depend upon the scale. So where we have our intercatenation as absolute, we can absolutely measure the computing power, the intercatenating power of a subject. When it comes to our physical exertions, these are entirely scale dependent. If you have a microchip that processes then the absolute quantity of throughput of computations per a unit of time, that is not so with the physical. An ant is going to have a drastically different process power and precision capacity than, say, a human being. They're not going to be equivocal, and so they are relative to one's scale. So, that is then the ability for a naturally or artificially integrated system to subsist by, of, and for the implicit ends which enable its continuity. Then coming to what we were discussing previously, we have our metataxis. The microtaxis is the propositional grammoscalar sum under command of an entity. So, as we were talking about earlier, this is based upon the propositional level, the 0th order of logic. In the grammoscale, for those of you who are coming new to this, that is described in the Panotrivium standard model, in the Dawning of a Trivium video, but also as it will come out in the future, but I'll give it here. The grammar scale is the measure, the absolute measure of identity or causality. Simple as. That is then further abstracted in the panodialectices as the panodialectic flow, flux, kinetization, however you might want to envision or look at it. It is, therefore, an absolute 1-to-1 ratio between a certain amount of semantic, syntactic, or semiotic value. And that is, of course, within the context of the game. So coming back to that, that is the propositional grammoscalar sum. Mesataxis, the predicative grammoscalar sum under command of an entity. Macrotaxis, the domaining grammoscalar sum under command of an entity. And finally, we have the leveled metataxis, right? So it's leveled in that it has a distinct casting of these various ability scores. Propositional, predicative, and domaining. What might you wonder is domaining? The domaining is directly correlative to the semiotic. It is the abstracted structure of predicates. It is a modalization. And that, of course, can be further referenced in the previous video, Dawning of Attributum. So, it is the ability of a thing to, by some cognitive or physiologic interface, encode, recode, and decode dialectophores in a controlled manner. That means the magical or historic contingencies that an individual is reliant upon in relation to something in their subjective self that it controls, commands, interfaces with, operates, any one of these things that enables its perpetuation to some extent or another. You can think of it like currency if you want. You can think of it like currency if you want. If you want to think of it like denominations of value in that way, something that can be expended to a certain purpose. Although I think it's more fair to think of it as a natural resource, a self-renewing resource, something that, while it can only be used for one thing at one time per section, it must be able to be reallocated to something else, as the dialectophores, while this was not made explicit in the original presentation but will be going forward, is permanent. It is permanent substance. It is something that is retained under all circumstances. It is neither created nor destroyed. It simply is and is and is. So to come back around to all of this, to give a brief recap, and then we'll finish out the stream here, as we are coming up on 2 hours 30 of basically just straight talking outside of our brief reprieve with Hotline Miami. We had the original ideas that were used to get us from a very rough base substrate of the Panotrivial standard model, which I don't even remember at this point what the original title was, into the into the panodialectic that we now have today, and have, in fact, built heavily upon so that it's only a section of the overall panology. The account or study of everything in the Panotrivium. The three roads of everything, if you want a very literal translation. We have this little aside here for a species building exercise for the ideas behind that. Although, of course, neither are those entirely permanent. We have the basis, much like this for the cosmology, for the core mechanics, the core ability scores, though that will, of course, not be what they're called whenever they come about. You have all of the distinctions within the connection in the physique, the cognition in the interface, the simulation in the calculation, and all bringing it together into an ultimate ability score of congregation. You have the disordered ascendancies. They have no special position in relation to one another, and you have the classes as they the calculative levels as they were once put back as in their earliest iterations. That describes something of the scale or scope. These were then later refined whenever things were not so easy, as I did not have a cell phone at the time to work on this with, into the distinct ability scores with a proper relational positioning to one another and the recognition of the scale as an independent entity in calculation, connection, and composition as intercatenation, physique, and metataxes, changing the parts of these, not just in the relation, but also the entire recognition of the sort of magical or historic relation, terms, I should say, as they were. Sorry, my voice is starting to get rather coarse. Into microtaxes, mesotaxes, and macrotaxes, a recognition of contingency as simulacra, as parts of a simulation. Those are then further expounded into their separate orders, placed in a relational recognition as absolute, relative, or leveled, and then given working definitions that enables all of these to serve as the primary non-derivative values of a character, creature, or subject in the broadest sense. That all being said, this has been a fantastic time going through all of the details of this, in addition to wrapping up Hotline Miami, which was a great time. Being able to reflect on all of that and seeing the finishing out of just a fantastic piece of art, truly, on every level. But it is time to draw to a close. So in that, if any of you thought that this was, worthwhile in watching, or at least considering, maybe this all seemed like technobabble or something utterly incomprehensible to those of a more regular or traditional mindset looking out on the world, usually with either idealistic or realistic philosophies to the whole thing, the episteme and the ontology. Seeing more of a post-structural or postmodern, depending on who you ask, outlook on things. I ask you, I implore you, please share this stuff around. You know, we have an X or Twitter, whichever you prefer, an Instagram, a Discord if you think you might want to talk with not only me, but others on all kinds of creative and artistic pursuits and enterprises. We also have, of course, YouTube itself that you can send links directly from, and two comment sections that we absolutely need filling, as I very much appreciate and rely upon feedback, as this will be released as a product in the end of its development cycle. And otherwise, you know, if you might have a little bit more that you would like to give to us, maybe you want to ease the burdens of needing to keep the lights on, and so working overtime job. Maybe you want to see maybe even little old Kairos be able to do this as a living and make something of a more content and product. Maybe not need to take a week off in order to catch up with everything that I've been working on, and you know, keeping up with real life stuff on top of it. There is always Streamelements if you want to do like a one-time thing. I believe they have a recurring model if you want to make it happen. That is linked down in the description on the channel page, and also in most of my X posts now. There is, if you want to do this in a, you know, easier way and get something directly in return other than sharing the goodness of your heart and wallet with little old me, there is Patreon, where starting at $5 per month, $5 little old dollars, you can get a few things as a proponent. You can get all of the content here, ad-free, uncensored, if there should be any, you know, disputes with content, or I have to modify anything to YouTube's guidelines, arbitrary as they might be. Or, of course, you want to have your credits here at the end of the video. That is something that will stay eternal, as all things on the internet are, entirely and completely immemorialized. Besides, you also get a vote in all polls. You know, maybe I'm undecided about something and I want input from people who are on the inside of my content, who are caught up with everything that I'm doing, maybe in terms of, you know, the Panotrivial, the threefold manifolds game system, or maybe just a video. Hey, you know, I've got a whole sea of things that I'm going to be looking at that have inspired me, that have carried me through, that have given me new insights, that are things that are simply downright interesting that I might want to make something on. Polls for everybody. And, of course, if you think you might want to give more, there's the $10 exponent level and the $20 ultraponent level. For those of you that were paying attention to the prefix of ultra before, you know that means beyond, and a placer as opponent, a stater, a doer. And all of these, of course, carry over all of the lower tiers from proponent up, and you get a few pieces of access to things like all of my workshop content, which happens to include things like my photographs here. Maybe you want to keep these notes as they... Maybe if I make it as a game developer for tabletop role-playing games, or at least content for it, will be pieces that are worth collecting. Maybe they inspire you, maybe there's something you want to reference for your own works. Whatever the case, if you got time, I ask for at least a little. If you got money, I'll also ask for a little. But more than anything, I thank you all for being here with me today, taking a look at Traumatic Calculus. And without further ado, never miss your opportunities. This has been Kairos.